Hello, good evening. Welcome. My name is Rowan Neufeld. I'm the events coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. From this end, we are streaming live from Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation and the traditional lands of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. Welcome to the launch of Flight, Stories of Canadian Aviation, Volume 3, and Fun on the Farm 3. We're joined tonight by Deana J. Driver, who's going to introduce both books, as well as a selection of DriverWorks Ink's other fall titles. So thanks to Deana for joining us tonight. Before I pass things along, I have a couple brief Zoom housekeeping items. We've enabled live auto captions tonight, which you can access by clicking the live transcript button along the bottom of your screen. We'll have some time for questions later in the evening as well. So if you're comfortable using the Q&A box to submit those, please do so. Deana J. Driver is an author, editor, book publisher, and retired journalist in Regina. She's the author of 5 nonfiction books and has contributed to more than 12 other books, including the 3rd volumes of Flight, Stories of Canadian Aviation, and Fun on the Farm, True Tales of Farm Life. Deana has worked with about 40 Prairie authors to publish more than 90 books since 2008, when she published her book publishing company, or when she founded her book publishing company, DriverWorks Ink. She also enjoys gardening, photography, singing, and going for long walks near hills, trees, and water. So welcome, Deana Driver. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. As Rowan said, I'm going to be talking about the 3rd volume of the Flight series, and these are all 3 of the books, and this is the one that I'll be reading from tonight. And I'll tell you a bit about those, and then I'll talk about the Fun on the Farm series of humorous anecdotes about farm life. So you heard a bit of my background, and this is my 20th year since I wrote my first book, and that seems like a crazy number, but it's quite exciting and quite a celebration. My first book was about the history of the Weyburn Inland Grain Terminal, so that project was so much fun, and the people so great to work with, and the story so unique and so interesting that I knew as a journalist that there were other wonderful stories out there that I thought were worthy of books. And so I teased the folks out at Weyburn that I blame them for all of these books that litter my life now in a wonderful way. And the Flight series that I'm going to be talking about first, this is the 3rd volume, as Rowan mentioned, and it is a collection of short stories written by different people all across Canada, including myself. The idea came from a book called Prairie was one of the first books that I published, and those were stories of the late Walter Williams of Crawford, Saskatchewan, and he was a sort of an unofficial air ambulance pilot, and his stories were so unique and so interesting that anytime I had that book out at a craft show or at a book signing or a bookstore, anywhere like that, people would come up and tell me about other really unique, wonderful aviation stories that happened to them or someone they knew. And so I knew there were lots of one-of-a-kind stories that would fill another volume. So that's where Flight came from. I published the 1st volume in 2019, 2nd volume last year during the pandemic, and 3rd volume this year during the pandemic. This volume is there are a number of stories in this volume in particular about women in aviation. And I wrote the majority of the stories in the 1st volume, wanting to introduce that series and that concept to readers and to people in the aviation industry. And then by the 2nd volume, folks who'd read the 1st volume, I'd asked for submissions. And so more people from across Canada submitted their stories or ideas of who I should contact. And by the time this 3rd volume came around this year, I actually had to put a stop to submissions and set some aside for a future volume because I wanted to write some stories and get some of my own work in. So there are 6 stories in this volume that I wrote, and they are about 3 Saskatchewan women, or people who worked in Saskatchewan, and 1 man in Ontario. So I'll take a moment and read a piece from one of the stories, and the story is called Female Ag Pilot, and it's about Laura Lawrence in Moose Jaw. So when Laura started as an aerial applicator pilot in the Moose Jaw area in 2017, she was the only commercially operated female spray pilot in Canada. There are a few in Australia, some in Brazil, and a handful in the States, says Laura, who was 27 years old at the time she switched from office duties with Provincial Airways to take on that role. There are getting to be more female aerial application pilots, and that's awesome, she says. In Canada, there's another woman who does this in Manitoba and has been active for several years. They have their own private farm, but it's not a commercial operation. In year 2 of my aerial applicating flights, there was another female spray pilot at the same company that I was at. So that was really cool. 2 female aerial application pilots were operating in Canada in 2021 that I knew of. Laura came to the aviation industry by osmosis. Her father, Brooke Lawrence, was a pilot with the Canadian Forces Snowbird Air Demonstration Squadron in 1990-1991, based out of Moose Jaw, and he was later a WestJet pilot. Laura's parents offered to pay for her flying lessons if she was interested in taking them, so she was definitely interested. Having flown right seat with her dad on several occasions while he worked as a corporate pilot, and later while he had shares in small Cessnas, but things didn't quite go as planned. Laura took her first lesson in high school at age 17 and thought about getting an aviation diploma at Mount Royal College in Calgary, but she decided on a semester of business agriculture in Saskatoon instead. And she quickly realized that she'd rather be flying. So she set her new sights on the Medicine Hat Flight College program. The year that she wanted to go, they canceled the program. So she went for the semester of college, hoping the flight would start again. It didn't. She returned to Moose Jaw looking for a job and was hired by Provincial Airways at the Moose Jaw Municipal Airport. I applied to be an aircraft loader. They offered me an office job, she said. The new office manager didn't show up for work, and Laura moved into that role for 7 years. When I first started there, it was May 2010. That kicked me into wanting to finish my pilot license. So I finished it that summer and became a private pilot. I knew I wanted to do something with aviation. I didn't know what that was. Laura says she'd always liked farming and had played hockey with a number of farm girls in the area when she was younger. She'd visited their farms on weekends and helped out whenever needed, but she'd never seen a spray plane until the job at Provincial Airways, which provides private and commercial aircraft maintenance and aerial application services. Now Laura was not only seeing the planes up close, but she was managing the logistics for all the spray orders as well. So as that business grew, Laura began wondering what it would be like to be out of the office and in a spray plane instead. I didn't think about being a spray pilot too much, she says. Then after a few years, I thought maybe it was something I wanted to do. Her dad was against the idea because he feared for her safety. But she says he came around after seeing how much advanced technology was involved and how well the crew at Provincial Airways operated. Laura admits to being a little jealous at times of the aerial application pilots. There was just me managing the office, and the job was all-encompassing. The office would be crazy sometimes. I'd be there more than 12 hours a day, some days, and I couldn't take off. I watched the pilots take off and leave the chaos of the office. I wish that was me. That being said, the flying is extremely grueling. It's long hours, the air is not always nice and stable. You have a lot of days where it's bumpy all day long and you just can't wait to stop flying. But there's definitely a romance there. First thing in the morning was always beautiful. My favorite time to fly was in the evening, she said. I loved the feeling I got shutting down at night when everyone was back safe and had done a good job that day. So in 2017, she took a 40-hour aerial application course from Battleford's Airspray. Then she returned to Moose Jaw and started her first season. Then she goes on to explain the details of what is involved in aerial application work. And she talks about spraying fungicide or insecticide on crops. And in the fall before harvest, people transition to a herbicide application to desiccate, dry down the crop. And then she says, drift comes into play and you have to be more experienced. You don't want to drift on someone else's crop. And there's a GPS in the aircraft. You set your field boundaries and your GPS will give you all the lines to spray. On a half-mile field or a quarter section, it will give you about 40 lines with a 66-foot swath width. Usually, you'll use a racetrack pattern. You'll start at one side of the field. It will take you to the middle, to the next line, and to the middle again. When you get to the field, You do a couple passes to check and note any obstacles either in the field or beyond. And there's a smoker on the aircraft to determine what the wind is doing at the prescribed field. That last part was in answer to specific questions that I asked Laura, because as a person who's grown up on a farm and has lived in Saskatchewan 40 some years, I've often seen aerial applicators, or crop dusters as they used to be called in the old days, and I'm old. I often wondered, how do they do their work? How do they know? And the days before GPS, I don't know how they did it. I guess they just were very cognizant of where they were flying and what they were doing and where they must have their own markers. So that was kind of interesting information for me. The book, although it's a salute, this series is a salute to people in aviation. They're people stories. They're not so much about the planes or what they weigh or what they do, although that was a unique, said unique a lot tonight, but that was a sort of a special explanation of how aerial crop spraying works. Most of the stories are about people and the situations that they find themselves in or the things that they've accomplished. One of the other people that I wrote a story about is Lisa McGuire, and she has worked in Saskatchewan for a bit as a flight attendant, and she's from Gagetown, New Brunswick area. And this is called, this is a piece of the story called The Most Annoying Passengers. While spending precious bonding time with her father at their cottage near CFB Gagetown in New Brunswick, Lisa McGuire watched water bombers swoop down to the lake and fill up with water. I was 12 years old, and I remember thinking that was one of the coolest things I'd ever seen in my life, says Lisa, who went on to work in aviation because of that experience. My dad was an RCMP officer, and after he retired, he became a flight attendant with WestJet. I went to university for accounting, but he encouraged me to be a flight attendant. So Lisa decided to give it a try. She worked for WestJet for a few years and had many interesting experiences during her flight attendant duties. Some are more memorable than others. Growing up in New Brunswick, she had learned both English and French. So she was comfortable speaking in both languages while presenting the onboard safety demonstration. When briefing passengers about opening the windows, you have to say, if you forget what I've said, look at the placard on the window and follow the instructions. In the first 2 years, Lisa kept telling them in French to look at the placard. Nobody corrected her until one passenger asked, "Are you trying to say placard?" I answered, "Yes. Are you French?" The passenger said, "That's not the right word." It turns out that placard in French means cupboard, not the instruction sheet that Lisa was trying to bring to their attention. Really, she said, no, none of my flight attendants had ever noticed it. Nobody had ever corrected it. You just have to shake your head, she says with a smile. There were several other memorable experiences with passengers who were not as polite or as kind. You meet a lot of characters when you're a flight attendant, Lisa says politely. Many of the more frustrating incidents occur when passengers have been drinking alcohol and start doing crazy things, causing flight attendants to wonder what's happening or when or how it will end. The job requires a patient and calm attitude towards guests, and sometimes it requires a little help from other staff members too. On one flight, in the middle of service, which is walking through the plane and offering different beverages or snacks to passengers, Lisa was handing a cup of ginger ale to a passenger. There was turbulence, and the smallest drop went onto her pants. The woman stood up and went into an absolute fit, recalls Lisa. She insisted the pants were expensive silk and were ruined. Lisa wasn't convinced. It was ginger ale. It wasn't going to wash. It was going to wash out either way. But Lisa could not tell her true feelings to the passenger. We offered her a voucher for dry cleaning. She went to the front of the plane and tried to tell us they were $200 silk pants. The pilot actually took $200 out of his wallet and said, "Here you go sit down." The woman didn't know what to do. She did go back to her seat. She was a bit much. And she goes on to say that that woman was nothing compared to the worst passenger that she's ever had in her life. I'm not going to read that story for you tonight. And the last story that I want to read from this book is called From Saskatchewan to South America, and a piece of it, it's about Barb Cote, who lives near Saskatoon. And she and her husband and their kids were on their farm at Least, Saskatchewan in January 2006, when they decided Barb and her husband, John Cote, decided that they would take a break from farming for a couple of years and they would go south, like to Chile, south. So Barb had a real interest in going places. She says, I'm the type of person who likes to get in a plane to go somewhere. And I see it as a way to get me somewhere and see things I can't normally see. So she obtained her pilot license in 1994, to be about 10 years, 12 years before this event. And she had co-owned a Cessna 150 with John's family members before they purchased their own Cessna Cardinal in about 2002. So here we are in 2006, and they've decided that they're going to go down south. Barb says, I got really nervous flying over the Quill Lakes, because it's a lot of water. And the irony of this comment is not lost on her as she thinks of the adventures that she was about to experience with her own plane in the next 2 years. They'd purchased their grain farm from John's parents and had expanded it. And in 2001, they were named Outstanding Young Farmers of Canada. And Barb had traveled to numerous countries after being awarded the prestigious Neufeld Canada Agricultural Scholarship. But their professional lives were in a strategic planning session, and they thought this was the right time to do something different. So off they went to Chile, where John had traveled before as an alumnus of the Canadian Agricultural Lifetime Leadership Program. He said the agriculture there was phenomenal, and Barb was excited to see the rural areas of Chile. The problem was that Chile didn't want them. So they said, come for 6 months and then leave. And they didn't want to give us a temporary resident visa. So they tried every avenue, but instead ended up going to Morelia, Mexico, driving their own van down there and enjoying the first part of this adventure with their 4 children, aged 6 to 13. Since choosing Mexico in place of Chile, John mentioned to Barb that it would be fun to have their airplane down there because the weather was lovely. And Barb said, don't say that because I will do it, which she promptly did. He's by far my biggest enabler, Barb says of her husband. He's the one who put this idea in my head and he supported me. We'd been in Mexico for 2 weeks when I flew back to get the plane. I left him with the 4 children. He had to deal with schools and finding a house, a home. When we moved to Chile 8 months later, he took off to Kazakhstan and we evened out the parental duties, she smiled. When Barb asked other Saskatchewan pilots who she should call to help her fly her Cessna from Saskatchewan down to Mexico, they recommended that she call Lauren Carefoot, a Swift Current farmer, because he'd flown to Panama before. The first time they spoke by phone, they talked for 20 minutes. Lauren said, you know, if you really want to do this, I'll come with you. And that was it. The more we talked, we made plans that he would fly as my co-pilot, she said. The plan was that I'd fly from our farm at Leask to Swift Current. I'd spend the day with Lauren to meet his family, and we'd then fly to Mexico. Weather socked me in at home, so the way it turned out, I jumped in the plane and flew to Swift Current. He hopped in, we took off, and within 10 minutes, I was across the border with a man I'd never met before. So that's a peek at some of the stories from the flight series. They're fascinating adventures for adults, people of all ages, actually, I guess from teenagers up. And then the next series is Fun on the Farm. There are 3 in this series as well. Fun on the Farm 3 is the one that I'll be reading a couple pieces from tonight. The concept of this series came from my late husband, Al. We had published 2 books. One was Egg Money from Saskatoon German Committee, and that's related to the statue that's actually on Rivers Landing in Saskatoon called Egg Money. So you can look up the history of that sometimes, and I believe the Egg Money book is available at McNally Robinson still. And then we did a book called Pre-Money, and then Al said we should do a book of funny stories of the farm, and so that led to this wonderful series. Al passed away shortly before the first book was published, so the series is dedicated to him. And he's not a farm guy, he wasn't a farm guy, I am, I'm the farm kid, but he'd been married to me for so long and he'd heard some of the stories of my family and thought there's lots of other wonderful stories out there. And this is also a compilation. Some of the stories are by me, some are by a lot of other people. In this book, I've written in volume 3, Fun on the Farm 3, I've written about 6 or 7 stories, something like that. And a lot of them are related to my only brother and my youngest sister, Leanne, and some of their experiences. One of the stories that is getting a little bit of attention is one that I wrote called Country Wedding Calamities, and it's about Al's and my wedding in 1976. And it's a rural wedding, so Ukrainian Polish heritage, that's my background. And some of the, there were something like 10 high school kids that came from Regina, all drove 10 hours to Athabasca, Alberta, to be part of our wedding in January of 1976. So things went rather awry a few times with a free bar situation and teenagers being who they are. So I won't read about that piece, but you can imagine what that's about. But another unforgettable event from our wedding day happened when some of our Regina friends offered to take my sister Barb and Al's sister Linda back to the farmhouse at the end of the night. After dropping the girls off at the farm, our friends headed back to town as one of our best men, Rob Fargo, happily drove down a gravel road a few minutes away from our farm. And our friend Blaine suggested from the back seat that Rob should maybe slow down because Blaine thought the road curved up ahead. Nah, Rob said dismissively and confidently drove on. A few seconds later, the car careened across a T intersection and landed in a huge pile of snow in a deep ditch on the other side of the gravel road. There was no getting out of this snowbank. They had no shovel, no flashlight, no candles, or any other emergency supplies. Cell phones had not yet been invented, and it was almost 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning in January with no other traffic on this gravel road. Now what? They decided to check the car for damage. Realizing they couldn't open the car doors, 2 of them rolled down a window and climbed out into the snowbank to look the car over. Not even a scratch on the rented vehicle. Relief, kind of. They still had to get out of this predicament. They didn't have mitts with them, so Rob and Willie, in their dress suits and shoes, began using their bare hands to move the snow away from the exhaust pipe and the car doors. Finally able to open a door, they climbed back into the car and tried to warm up. Rob wanted to keep the engine running so the 4 teens inside would be warmer inside the vehicle. Blaine begged him to turn it off so they wouldn't die of carbon monoxide poisoning. Although Rob and Willie had pushed some snow away from the car's tailpipe, the risk of death by carbon monoxide was still a worry for Blaine, who rolled down his window a couple of inches to encourage any carbon monoxide to leave the car interior. After a few minutes, Rob turned the car off to save gas just as much as to keep Blaine quiet. They were soon cold, so Rob started the engine again, and Blaine opened the window again. They repeated this process of warming up, rolling down the window, turning off the car, shivering, and warming up again, while exchanging many unfriendly words over the next few hours. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, a truck came by and a man from Manitoba towed them out of the ditch. The teenagers sullenly drove back to Athabasca for a couple hours of sleep before having to meet the bride and groom at a local restaurant for breakfast. Only on the prairies can a car from Saskatchewan be pulled out of a ditch in Alberta by a truck from Manitoba, our friends told us when they laughingly recounted their adventure for many years afterwards. There's one other small piece that I'm going to read for you tonight. This book has 32 short stories and about 6 poems by different writers. Keith Foster is a Regina man who has contributed to a number of our books, and he has one short poem in this volume of Fun on the Farm 3, and it's called Ruler of the Roost. We had this horrible rooster. He'd strut around the yard as if he owned it, waking us up before the sun was up. That gall-darn rooster would sneak up behind us and peck at our ankles. We learned to walk softly and carry a big stick. The hens were his personal possessions. If he didn't want us near them, he'd block the way till we gave up. When that rooster got too old to produce, Dad lopped off his head. It wasn't the best tasting stew, but our revenge was sweet. The contributors to all of these books are a lot of Saskatchewan folks, a lot of Prairie folks, and these stories in particular are mostly Prairie stories. Farming on the prairies is sort of consistent in just the things that we did: Sunday ball games for fun, lots of visiting, fishing, trikes. There's some rural driving. I have a story about learning to drive a car when I was 11 or maybe 12, and another Saskatoon writer, Marilyn Frey, has a story called Crop Circles. Mary Halkin Bishop, who's one of the authors that I'm going to introduce you one of her new books in just a moment. She has some stories. Janice Howden. There's a number of folks that I work with who have contributed other pieces to these collections, and I'm very, very grateful for them and for this putting together these pieces of history and the pieces of life from the old days that wouldn't necessarily happen now. I want to take a moment to introduce some of the new books that I've published. I mentioned Mary a moment ago, and she's the author of the Tunnels of Moose Jaw series that we have updated and republished. Last year we did Tunnels of Time, which is a book that was first published 20 years ago, and it's about 13-year-old Andrea who falls back into the tunnels below Moose Jaw, falls back in time and finds herself in the 1920s days of gangsters. Second book in the series is brand new, called Tunnels of Terror. And this is about Andrea falling back with her younger brother, Tony, into the tunnels and coming upon a theft ring. And these books are based on some true events in Saskatchewan history. And Mary has a very talented writer, and these books are super popular in the school system and with adults alike. I'm hearing every day, I hear from an adult who says they're so well written. I love the stories. And my theory on that is that if it's a kid's book and you can't enjoy it as an adult, then it leaves something to be desired. So one of the many things that we did in republishing these books, we had some beautiful illustrations done by a young woman named Wendy Miguel. And so there are 10 or 12 illustrations in each book. And Mary also has some resources at the back. There's some historic notes. There's pieces of a newspaper article from Moose Jaw in this second book. There's discussion questions, and in this, there's even a You Be the Author section in the Tunnels of Terror book. We also recently became the distributor for the 5th book in the series called Next Stop Chicago, and that talks about Andrea and her brother going to Chicago to look at to get involved in the history of their grandfather when he was a young boy. 2 other books that I've been pleased to publish this year. Saskatoon authors, the man on the front is Evan Wall from Shelburne, Saskatchewan. He lives in Saskatoon now. And Suzanne Gauthier of Saskatoon met him at a gym in Saskatoon and wondered what his story was and started asking questions. Evan was a very active, enthusiastic, a very charismatic, mischievous young man who was in a car accident and resulting in a traumatic brain injury. And so this is Evan's story about life after that accident and with the brain injury, and what he can teach us, and what his new life is like, and how he is dealing with this phenomenon of ableism, living in a world that is built for people who are able-bodied, and the life-altering trauma. But he's still a witty wisecracker, and this is a really fascinating book that could teach us so much. And those are the types of books that I enjoy writing, reading, and publishing. The latest book, this one has become very popular very quickly. Don't they kick when you do that? Stories of a Prairie Veterinarian by Dr. Gary Hoyam of Weyburn, Saskatchewan. This is Gary on the front cover. You can see he looks like he's enjoying this way too much. And this is a collection of short stories that Gary wrote about his 30-some years as a veterinarian on the prairies. There are, I think there's 40 different chapters in here. Each one is a story about some event or interaction with humans, animals, pets, a mixed animal, a veterinarian. There's a bird's eye I viewed, feather pens, nice but not cheap, I'm so hungry I could eat. Those are some of the titles of the chapters. Thanks, Doc, I needed that. So these are the books that I'm pleased to present tonight. And I thank you for your time and for your interest. And if you have any questions, I would be pleased to hear from you. You can put them in the chat if you like.
Thank you so much, Deana. I'm wondering what is coming up for you in the winter, spring 2022.
I'm working with a Saskatoon author to publish her memoir of her work, her story with her mom, who is of Jamaican descent. And we've got one of the authors, another Saskatoon author. I'm working with a lot of Saskatoon people lately. And she is working on a second book in her children's series. I think Mary seems to be a walking encyclopedia of, not encyclopedia, but she has many. Mary Bishop is a third author that I'm working with. We're hoping to republish the third volume in her series this coming year. And then there are a couple of new folks that have contacted me about their manuscripts, and we're in various stages of process with that. This is the last of the Fun on the Farm series. I decided to end that one at 3, and I will probably be doing the 4th flight book this coming year too. As I said, I already have stories for that set aside, so we'll see where that goes.
Excellent. Always glad to hear that you're working with some Saskatoon folks. So we'll keep an eye out for those. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Flight Stories of Canadian Aviation Volume 3 and Fun on the Farm 3 are available at McNally Robinson, along with all of the other titles that Deana introduced tonight. So I think we'll end things there. Just wanted to also say that we appreciate your support so much and look forward to being able to safely host in-person events again. Until then, please keep an eye on our coming events page and just our website in general to find out more about our virtual events and upcoming releases. So until next time, take care, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.